welcome everybody. Thank you all for joining the National LGBTQ plus Bars How to Become a Law Teacher webinar. My name is Ryan Nelson. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm an associate professor of law at South Texas College of Law in Houston, Texas, where I teach civil procedure and employment law. Our goal today is to introduce you to the different kinds of law teachers and explain how you can become one yourself so we can expand queer representation amongst legal academics. If you do have any questions, please put them in the Q&A feature, and I'll try to get to them at the end. I've reserved about 10 to 15 minutes at the end so we can try to address questions. So let's kick it off. So for each of our four panelists, I was hoping you could introduce yourselves. Could you introduce yourself, tell us where and what you teach, and then give attendees a sense of what your day-to-day life looks like. And I just want to try to spend 2 to 3 minutes getting to know everyone, and then we'll ask some follow-up questions. So I guess, Nader, if you want to start us off.
Hi, what's up, everybody? Nice to meet you or talk to you all. I'm a lecturer in law is my official title at University of Southern California, Gould. I'm an adjunct, basically. And so I teach entertainment law, fundamentals of entertainment law. I'm actually teaching undergraduates as well. So it's a law school's course designed for undergrads, which is a great first course for me to teach. I've never taught before. And I thought going straight into the lion's den of law students would be a lot. And I think this is a great little entree. In terms of what am I doing day to day, I do have a day job. So that's generally what I'm doing every day. But it's shocking how busy one can be when they have two jobs. So I do spend a lot of time preparing slides, researching. I was just talking to a student actually, doing office hours, grading. Lots of things that when you're a student, you realize it's actually harder for the professor to do. Like, for example, we had our midterm, and I never thought I would say this, but I would have rather have taken my midterm than written it and graded it. So shocking, but lots of stuff like that I'm learning. So it's great. It's going well, time consuming, but very fulfilling. So very much enjoying it.
Great. Thanks so much. Alex, how about you?
Hi, everybody. My name is Alex Chen. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the founding director of the Harvard Law School LGBTQ plus advocacy clinic. I have been doing this job since the beginning of 2020 when I started the program. And I have like 7 jobs. It's the reality of being a clinic director. So I teach a doctrinal course on gender identity, sexual orientation law, and that's a course that both clinical and non-clinical students can take. But I also run our clinical program where student attorneys can work with my team on LGBTQ plus projects. And so we do a mixture of impact litigation work, policy and legislative advocacy, regulatory advocacy, and public education. So I also supervise student attorneys on our clinical projects, and I supervise our attorneys and fellows as well. And in terms of what I do with my day, it really varies, as you might imagine, as a result, right? Term times, there's a lot of student supervision, teaching, grading, and all of that. But all year round, on top of that, we also have cases. And so, I'm also litigating, testifying, working with legislative and community coalitions. So it really varies depending on what is going on. So there's never a dull moment in this job.
Great.
Although, Nate, I have to say, I hard disagree in the sense that I would never go back to being a student. And yes, it's annoying to grade people, but it's way better to grade than be graded, in my personal opinion.
All right, Kyle, you're up next.
Hi, everybody. My name is Kyle Velty, and I am a professor of law and the associate dean for faculty at the University of Kansas School of Law in Lawrence, Kansas. Since I became associate dean, my allocation of effort, as we talk about it in my job description, has shifted dramatically. And so 50% of my job right now is administrative, which includes chairing our hiring committee, which I'm glad to be able to speak with all of you today because we're in the middle of a very busy hiring season right now. This is my 3rd year of chairing that committee. So I've seen and gained a lot of insights from that process. I also teach 2 courses at KU Law. I teach evidence and torts, both in the fall semester. And because I'm an associate dean, I get a one course relief every year, so I don't teach in the spring. Although when I do teach in the spring, I typically will teach my sexual orientation and gender identity seminar. And my role as associate dean includes not just chairing the appointments committee, but I hire and supervise and train our adjunct professors. And I also am responsible for the intellectual life of the school, which is bringing in workshop speakers, helping our pre-tenure faculty and our junior faculty engage in their scholarly agendas and help support them in their scholarship and research and writing. And so my day-to-day really looks this semester a lot like shepherding through candidates who are on campus for on-campus interviews for finalists. We have 12 of those coming through this fall. There's quite a few. Teaching my courses and trying to get some scholarship written when I can grab 30 minutes here or there to work on that. So I'm really grateful you all are here today. We definitely need more representation in the legal academy, so I'm delighted to be a part of this panel today.
Great. Thank you so much. And Anthony.
Hi, I'm Anthony Nedwicki, he, him. I am currently on sabbatical. I like to be able to say that I've been in legal education for almost 30 years, and this is my first sabbatical ever. And so I'm enjoying it. I'm living in lovely Costa Rica for now, and well, actually permanently, and I'll get into that a little bit as we talk a little bit more. But I'm going to go back to teaching in the spring, and I'll be teaching contracts. But over the course of my career, I have taught legal writing, business law, employment law, those types of courses, and law and sexual orientation. My day-to-day right now is, this is going to be the first time I've taught a JD course online. So I'm creating a hybrid course. I teach at Mitchell Hamlin. I should have started with that. I'm sorry. I'm at Mitchell Hamlin School of Law in Minneapolis, very, very far away from Costa Rica, I'm glad to say. But I teach in a hybrid program. I'll be continuing to teach in a hybrid program at the school for the foreseeable future, which means I have to go back up to campus 4 times a year. But most of my classes will be taught in asynchronous courses and with some office hours that are synchronous. And we can answer those questions about what that means a little bit too. But a lot of schools are now starting to develop those types of programs. So there's a really good chance that many of you are probably going to teach in an online course or some type of hybrid or what we call blended learning types of courses.
Great. All right. Well, now that we've gotten to know our panelists a little bit, I want to transition to the bulk of our presentation and ask about each type of law teaching job and get insight from the panel about how you can kind of become that sort of teacher. And I'm going to try to go structured and ask, one at a time, but by all means, if any of the panelists have insights along the way, please feel free to jump in and we'll take it from there. So Nadir, we'll start with you. If we could talk about teaching part-time as an adjunct, what are schools looking for in an adjunct, and what was the process like for you to secure your job?
Yeah, I'll talk about my process first. But so I just thought that I wanted to teach. I've always enjoyed public speaking, and I would notice at work whenever I was able to give a presentation, I liked making the presentation. I liked giving it. I don't want to sound, too confident, but people would say they enjoyed listening to it. So I thought this kind of feels fun. This is maybe something that I might be good at. So let me look into it. I reached out to a friend of mine who is a professor, not at a law school, but just a professor. And I said, do you know of anybody who's an adjunct? How do they get the role? So I took a meeting with one of his friends, and he told me just cold email law schools in your area or who have programs that fit your expertise. Just go find the dean, any dean, email them, whether it's, say, I have a specific course that I want to teach, or I want to teach generally. Are there any openings? What I did is I initially started off saying I want to teach this one course that was about reality television. That's primarily what I worked in. And I thought was an interesting course that wouldn't exist anywhere. Wasn't getting much traction with that. And then I decided to come up with a different, more broad course. I had a light syllabus I put together, just like here's concepts that I would talk about in this course if I were to teach it. And that was probably part of my second round. So I started in March 2023. Nothing was really happening by October 2023. And then I did another round. At that point, I guess I had just missed the window of like when schedules for the spring get locked. So they said, come back to us in the spring. So last spring, I guess last February, I emailed USC by chance. They actually had an opening for the exact course that I wanted to teach. The person who was teaching fundamentals of entertainment law was leaving. They said, do you want to teach that course? I said, yes. And a year after starting, I had found my role. So I would say cold emailing is really the way to go. Every so often, I will see a job listing for an adjunct professor, but in my experience, that is a technicality that it's being posted. It's probably already filled when it is being posted. They're posting it because it's filled. That's what happened with mine. I saw a job posting for the job I have now after they gave it to me or offered it to me. So don't wait around looking for a job posting. It probably will not happen. And just come up with an idea for a course. I think it's easier to say yes to a specific course rather than sure, do you want to teach something, and then have the conversation about that. So definitely put some behind it. Don't go crazy, like a one pager about like, here are the classes that I would think, a week on defamation, a week on right of publicity, whatever it might be, whatever contract, whatever course topics are relevant to your course. And then, so what are they looking for? Ironically, I think that they're looking for people who are also eager to learn, because obviously adjuncts are not academics. They're people who are working in the legal field. And so I have to acknowledge I've never taught a course before. I don't really know what I'm doing, and I'm learning as I'm going. And I think that's probably a requirement of any adjunct who starts. You have to be able to be willing to humble yourself and say, I don't know. Who can I ask for help? And luckily at USC, there's a lot of support that I can lean on. I'm grading midterms right now, currently trying to figure out what is a curve? How do I make this a curve? So it's interesting, to work through that. And then in terms of like the kind of person that they want, I think, they want someone who's in the field that they're teaching. So I work in entertainment, I work at Snapchat, I worked at NBC prior. I have a lot of stories to talk about that are really relevant to the topics that we talk about in class. And so that's what makes it interesting. And obviously, people who are teaching full-time in law school can also have plenty to share. If you're working full-time outside of the classroom, though, you might have some more current topical things to talk about. It might be more common for you to do that. So I think being able to bring your outside experience into the classroom is super valuable and what they're looking for. So don't be scared, obviously, to remain an expert at your day job and continue doing that. Because that's kind of what's going to make you a better adjunct in my experience. And I'd even noticed just like monitoring the news, like reading like, Deadline or Variety, just what I do normally as part of my job every day. Like, for example, we were talking about defamation, and there's a case about baby reindeer, and Netflix is being sued for defamation. I had a whole class set up about, let's talk about this case because it's topical, it's interesting, and they all watch Baby Reindeer. When I talk about Desperate Housewives, they don't know what I'm talking about. But when I talk about the new Netflix show, that's a reference that they can get. So it's funny how a lot of your outside experience naturally will find its way into the classroom I'm finding. So I think that's probably what's important to bring.
That's great.
Ryan, can I mention something?
Yeah, go for it.
I failed to mention that I also am a former dean and a former associate dean. And I think if you're looking to be an adjunct, Nader mentioned sending an email or sending your resume to the dean. I recommend sending it to the associate dean if you can. The other thing I would recommend doing, because that's where I would just forward it to. So I would also recommend actually going to your former school where you graduated, if you're living close by there, and talking to a couple of your former professors and asking about how you can get involved. A lot of times the adjunct, this isn't probably the best way to do it, but it's how it happens, is that people know each other and they help introduce each other to the associate dean or whoever's going to do the hiring. So I would actually go and actually make some conversations with people that you know at any of the schools that you might be close to.
Yeah, I want to add on to that. Actually, that's all super, super helpful. And I happen to have a friend who works at USD Law School who said, hey, if you email now, they're looking for someone. So I was going to email anyway, but I might not have emailed the day. Maybe someone would have emailed before me. So actually having someone there who can help you is super, super helpful. Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah, I know associate deans are usually looking for a robust field of different courses they can offer. And when you kind of give them something on a platter and say, hey, I can teach this, just let me know, that's like a godsend to a lot of the associate deans for faculty. So when I was trying to adjunct, I would search schools in my area and I would look up the courses that they offered in the past year or two and see any holes that needed filling. So I'm a labor and employment person. So if I saw that they had taught employment law, but not employment discrimination, I would prep, like Nader said, like a mini syllabus and send that off to the associate dean of faculty or the dean and say, hey, this could fill a need. All right, let's switch gears. So let's talk now about becoming a clinician. So Alex, if you could talk to us a little bit about what schools are looking for in a clinician and what was the process like for you to secure your job?
Yeah, great. Well, so it's funny because actually I kind of fell into all of this. Like I wasn't really thinking I would go into legal academia really like anytime soon. Before I was here, I was at the National Center for Lesbian Rights, where I was an LGBT, impact litigator, and I did national civil rights cases. And I had thought I would do that whole like revolving government and nonprofit thing for like maybe a couple decades, and then maybe like teach like as a sort of kind of sinecure, put me out to pastor kind of thing. So I was like my 50s or 60s or something like that, and maybe a professor of practice or something. But what happened was actually, and I think it really accords with what you all were just talking about, is I was at a reunion for a fellowship program that one of my professors helped me get when I was a student, and I ran into her, and she was asking me what I was up to, and I was telling her about some of the cases I was litigating. I was like doing some of the Trump military ban cases at the time and some other things like that. And she was like, "Oh, that sounds really interesting. You should come back and teach a course." And I was like, "What?" and she was like, "Yeah, like you should just, And I was like on what? And she was like, "Whatever you want." And so I was like, okay. So I sort of sat down and thought about it, and I thought that'd be an interesting experience. And I looked up, because I was really specializing in transgender rights at the time, what courses other T14 law schools had taught on transgender rights issues in the last like 10 to 20 years I could find online. And, they'd been really sporadic, right? So I was like, okay, like there's kind of a gap where no, like, top 14 school is consistently offering like a good course on gender identity and the law. So I just proposed a seminar similar to what Nadir said, just like listed out like 12 possible classes I would teach and a couple cases I would cover in each one. Sent that to her. She sent it to the curriculum committee, and they asked me to come back. So I was actually just scheduled originally to come to adjunct for a term, and then the law school separately decided they wanted to start this LGBT clinic, and at the time it was only one of a handful of schools, and it still is only a handful of schools that has one, and they were looking for a director. And so I actually went to like an alumni event in San Francisco. Saw the former dean, who's now the provost, and he was like, we're hiring for this position. You should apply. And I was like, absolutely not. Having a great time in San Francisco, not interested. Like, have a good time searching. I'll help send that listing out. But I think a couple of people reached out to me at the law school about it, and were like, why don't you just think about it? So I think I kind of got sucked in or bamboozled a little bit into doing it, I think. But I'm not sad about it. Like I'm actually really happy it happened because before I went into academia, I'd never taught before, and I think I just didn't really know what it would be like and whether I'd like it or not. But I think it turns out I really love it. In the end, the dean was like, "Why don't you just come for a couple of years? It's not going to hurt your career. You can always leave." And I was like, okay, let's do it. So, I got here and I realized I really love teaching. I really love working with students. And it's really beautiful. Like, it's a really cool experience. I think when I first got here, I like had coffee with Martha Minow, who used to be the dean before John Manning. And, she was like, I asked her, like, what is the thing that you didn't expect about teaching or that like I might not expect now, right? And she said, the thing is like actually like right now, because you're young and you just came from practice, you're really focused on like the substance of the things you're going to do, like the projects and the cases and like the substantive impact in the world. And that's cool. But the gift of teaching is that you are actually going to get to influence these young people at this really formative time in their life, and like in this very formative time in what kind of lawyer they're going to be. And like the influence you'll have by doing that over time, you're going to see is far greater than the influence of just the things that you're going to do substantively, like affecting and shaping how students think about what the law is at this time is really one of the most impactful things you can do in the legal profession. And I think, as it turns out, she's 100% right? Well, she's always right, but that's the thing about Martha. But like it really is incredible. And even though I've only been doing it for 5 years, I've already seen students of mine go out and join the field, become fellows, like become budding scholars, become sort of advocates, and it's really incredible. So I think that's the thing that like I will say, if you're thinking about doing it, I think it can get kind of easy to get caught up in a lot of these technicalities we're about to talk about like how you do it and what you would and all of that. But I think like the core question should be like, why do you want to do it? And I think that like a really good reason is because you want to influence students, right? I think another component is scholarship. So what I'll say is that like because of the way I ended up in this position, and because Harvard doesn't really have a scholarship requirement for its clinicians, I didn't have to have like a work of scholarship or like a sort of a like a scholarship to offer. But most clinical jobs do. And clinical jobs really vary much more than doctrinal jobs in like what the school is expecting, like how much time they think you should be spending on teaching versus scholarship. But if you want to go on the general clinical teaching market, like having some scholarship that is more sort of oriented towards practice is an important component if you want to have like job options and flexibility in the field. I've ended up writing just because like I've wanted to, and it turns out that there's writing that is like relevant to the work that we're doing that I think is really interesting. And so I've ended up carving out some time to do scholarship, but I think that's like an important thing just to mention. And in terms of like what kinds of practice experiences are relevant, it really depends on what kind of clinical programs you're interested in, because so a lot of clinical programs will do direct services work. And then if you like come from like legal aid or direct services and like housing or employment or whatnot, that's good. But also, like HLS is an example of a school where we actually have over 30 clinical programs, and a lot of them are not just about direct services, right? So we've got, sports law, we have like appellate clinics, we have the International Human Rights Clinic. Our clinic is more focused on litigation and policy. So, it can be a variety of different things, but generally speaking, you're going to want to look for clinical opportunities that are salient to some aspect of the practice experience that you have, right? So example, like if you want to do like an appellate law clinic, it's good to like, have had appellate experience, right? So relevant practice experience is really important for clinical jobs. And then I think, also having some scholarship aligned to that is also very helpful. And, I think Kyle and Anthony will talk a little bit also about the sort of more formal process where there is a sort of formalized hiring market for clinicians. But also, of course, there's a lot of idiosyncratic situations like mine where, schools are just looking to start something. And I think in general, like the thing to know about like law teaching market is like, it's kind of like the clerkship market in the sense that like a lot of it is about networks and who you know and inside information. And if you really want to do it, like the best thing to do is to just think about who do you know or have a connection with, like former professors or people in academia who can give you inside information, because you really want to network more than anything else. And, like they're looking to fill various like curricular needs, like clinical needs, hiring needs, like whichever version of the thing. There might be an official formal process, but if that's all you're engaging with, you are probably missing like 60% of the picture of what you ought to know. So just like network, talk to people, take people out for coffee, go to conferences, get to know people. And that's, it's a very much a who you know kind of profession, I think.
Great. Thank you, Alex. So we can hear my puppy agreeing in the background. So this is actually a good segue to the full-time teaching of doctrinal subjects or legal research and writing. So this is for Kyle and Anthony. If you could give us an overview of the AALS hiring process and what schools are looking for in prospective teachers. I guess, Kyle, we can start with you with the AALS hiring process.
Great. Thanks so much. So the ALS is the Association of American Law Schools, for those of you who aren't familiar with that. It's kind of the trade organization for law schools around the country. There's a few, 200 and some law schools, and most of them do their hiring for tenure track positions through the AALS's mechanisms, which is called the FAR, the Faculty Appointments Register. And I'm going to drop a link in the chat. The AALS has a wonderful page about how to become a law teacher, the different paths to doing it, to do it for legal writing, to do it for clinician, to do it for what we call doctrinal or podium teaching. That's just academic speak for what you might think of from law school when you're in your contracts class or your Civ Pro class or any of those hardcore substantive doctrinal classes. And so the typical law school, I would say, is looking for somebody whose job description will be 40% teaching, 40% scholarship, and 20% service, 40, 40, 20. So generally speaking, if you are an entry-level candidate, meaning you have no prior experience within the legal academy as a teacher, even if you've been an adjunct, typically you're going to be considered to be an entry-level candidate at that point, coming off of the adjunct market or adjunct experience. They will be looking for to be candid, at least one published law review article. That's what we mean when we talk about scholarship. We mean a traditional law review article. So if you were on journal or law review as a law student, this will be very familiar to you. If you weren't, this would be something you'd have to ramp up on or get up to speed on and have at least a work in progress. And a law review article is, I would say, between 18 and 25,000 words, heavily footnoted, 300 footnotes, something like that. And you will be expected to produce one of those a year at least when you are on the tenure track after you get hired. So, I think most people who are thinking about becoming law teachers who aren't familiar very much with the process, and I wasn't. I was a first-gen law student, and I woke up my third year thinking I think I want to teach law, and that I embarked on a multi-year journey to make that happen, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. But the scholarship piece is one that I think is hidden when you're a law student, right? You don't realize that your professors are actually the equal amount of time they're spending teaching, they're also researching and writing law review articles. So that's, I think, the biggest obstacle to entry into the tenure track market is being a productive scholar and having a body of work, or at least one. Most schools will say that they, for the entry level, are looking for scholarly potential. And I think 15 years ago, that would mean no publications, but one work in progress that has been accepted for publication. But nowadays, most candidates come on the market with at least one publication, sometimes 2 or 3 or 4. So we're seeing candidates be more and more credentialed as time goes by. And so anyway, back to the FAR. So you pay a fee, I think it's around $500 to submit your application to the AALS. And this opens up in June, and it's open till September. And it is called the FAR, the Faculty Appointments Registrar. Once you sign up for an account and you pay your fee, you fill out, basically it's a kind of a drop-down menu screen. At least it was when I filled out the FAR form. And you indicate your biographical information, where you went to school, educational and work history, and you fill in these fields. You put in your teaching preferences, and there's some strategy to that, which is a little more granular than I'll go at this high-level overview. And there's 2 places where you can put in a little bit of narrative, right, to describe your professional background and your teaching interests. Then there'll be a place for some references. And then there'll be a place for you to list your scholarship. And all of that gets uploaded into a database at the AALS. And those are distributed to the law schools who are paying members of the AALS at 2 points in August and September. And so then me as the hiring chair and my hiring committees have access to that AALS database. And the number of applicants has fluctuated over the last 10 years. If you want to really dig into the data, there's a professor at Northwestern. Her name is Sarah Losky, and she does fantastic data collection every year with graphs and kind of over time comparisons of number of positions and number of schools that are hiring and all those kinds of things. So I highly recommend the work she does every year. And in any event, you get this, you get into this database, and then hiring chairs and committee members can go in, and there's a search function. So if I know, like this year we're hiring for international comparative law, I can go in and just search people who have put in international comparative law, and just only their FAR forms will come up. So that's the way that we screen here, is by usually curricular need. And then we take a close look at every single FAR form that pops up for that curricular need and make our decisions about who we're going to do a screening interview with. So if you make it past that first cut, you'll get an email or a call from the chair of the committee saying, we saw your form in the FAR database. We are interested in offering you a screening interview, which used to be in Washington, D.C. at a huge conference. The AALS has kind of done away with that. So most schools, I think, do these on Zoom these days. That's what we've done ever since COVID has come along. So you'll be invited to a 25-minute screening interview. And we typically do 15 to 20 of those screening interviews for each position we're hiring for. So this year we're hiring for 3. We did about 40 different screening interviews with folks. 25 minutes, same 3 questions in every single one. We divide them up amongst our committee. We want to keep it very much the same for equity reasons. For getting back to Alex's point, we don't want it to be about who you know and who you can yuck it up with and whose name you could drop. We want it very standardized to have equity across different folks. From those screening interviews, we choose 3 to 4 finalists who we fly back to campus. They fly in on an afternoon. We have a candidate here this evening in Lawrence. The night before we call the callback, the candidate will have dinner with 2 or 3 faculty members at a restaurant near school. That's a chance for you to get to know the school, for them to get to know you a little bit more. The next day is what's called the callback. at least in my experience, it runs all day from 8 to 4, 8 to 5 a.m., somewhere in there. You'll have a series of meetings with the dean. You'll have an interview with different groups of faculty. Some schools bring small groups of faculty into a room. I've also done it where I've been at schools where I'm escorted to each particular faculty member's office for kind of one-on-one interviews. It really just depends on the school's approach to that. Here at KU, we have one session over breakfast with students. We have student leaders that come in and speak to the candidates and ask them questions. And then kind of the highlight of the day is what's known as the job talk. And that usually happens over the lunch hour, where all of the faculty come together in a room and you are the star of the show. You stand at the front of the room and you give a 20 to 25-minute talk on your scholarship, on your work in progress, that is your job talk paper, that is showing the faculty about your scholarship, the quality of it, and the potential you have as a scholar. After your 20 or 25 minutes has completed, then whoever's moderating the queue for questions will open up the floor to the faculty to ask you questions about your scholarship. And these can range from very assertive or engaged, some might say aggressive questions like, I challenge the premise of your entire paper. Tell me why it's valid, I loved this so much. This is in my field. And have you thought about X, Y, or Z? But it's really to see how you engage, not only on the substance of your scholarship and what kind of a subject matter expert you're becoming or hope to be in the area in which you write, but it's also a chance for us to see your teaching ability, because you are up there in front of us teaching us your paper. And so we also invite a couple students at KU to that job talk piece. And so we solicit feedback from our students. They email us their feedback. We anonymize that before we share it with the faculty in reports we write up on each candidate before we vote as a faculty. So I think I'll stop now. That was kind of a lot. There's a lot more detail we can go into. And I'm at the end here, I'm going to drop my email into the chat if anyone wants to reach out to me. I had a very winding path to become a law professor. And so it's doable. But for those of us who, didn't go to a T14 law school and know that when you went in, you wanted to teach law, it can take a few more steps and a few more years to get there. But it is definitely doable if it's a dream of yours. So I will stop for now.
Awesome. Thank you, Kyle. So Anthony, so I guess two follow-ups. So one is, I know you mentioned that you previously taught legal research and writing. So I wonder if you might briefly touch on how this process might differ for anyone in the audience who's interested in that route. And then Kyle's given us kind of the path of how you can go through this process. I'm interested more in what schools are looking for in the prospective teachers. So what are they looking for in these legal publications, for example, or what backgrounds are they interested in?
Yeah, that's really a lot of good information Kyle gave. It's overwhelming. I have to say, like my first couple of job talks, I was scared like you wouldn't even believe. It's so intimidating to be around these people that are experts, and you're now saying that you're going to be an expert. So I broke into the profession very weirdly. I didn't go to a T14 law school either, but I wanted to be a law professor. And so I thought, naively, I didn't go to any one of these types of presentations to figure out what the process is. So I did a little my own research and saw AALS had that process. So I went through that process the first time. I had maybe 2 interviews, one for a fellowship and one for another job. Neither one really seemed all that great to me. And so, but I did learn about the fellowship process. And so there's a lot of schools that have fellowship programs where they hire folks to go through for a year or 2, and they help you by giving you some teaching experience, but also time and support around you to do some scholarship. So I went through the Temple's fellowship program, which was a 2-year program, and you also got an LLM at the same time. And so I taught some doctrinal courses. I taught business law at the time that I was there, but I also had to teach legal writing. And so I taught both, and through that process, I went through the process again, the AALS process after that, and I had 20 interviews. Half of them were legal writing jobs, and half of them were for doctrinal positions. And what I learned through all that is that I wanted to do both. I love legal writing, but I also like teaching some of these other courses as well. So one thing I want to just lay out there about legal writing has had a long development over the last, I would say, 25 years or so. where it started out as mostly an adjunct type of program where adjuncts were coming in and teaching people how to do legal writing, where some schools just had students teaching other students how to do legal writing, and it's become more of a profession. And so you're going to now see law schools that have all kinds of different types of legal writing programs and different types of statuses for their professors. So you might have some schools that have adjuncts still, and you have some schools that have professors that are on short-term contracts that might be for a year or two, and then they go on. So similar to like the fellowship program. So they teach for a couple of years and then move on. What we're seeing is a large movement over the last couple of decades of schools hiring people to be full-time legal writing professors. And along with that, that's become a little bit more specialized field. And so there's more journals that are on how to write and what rhetoric is and advanced rhetoric and those types of things. And so there's a lot of developing scholarship out there that I think is interesting to folks. And so we've seen this growth of how legal writing is viewed as a field. Along with that, we've seen changes in the way that people are hired for legal writing programs. Before, it was really just knocking on the doors of the schools and then you were hiring. There wasn't a lot of advertisement. And then we saw, when I started breaking in, you started seeing schools hiring through the AALS process legal writing professors. And so I think that's become more of the norm now than before. But also schools have also done, whereas the AALS process really is mostly geared towards the first semester, so August to December. That's the process of you do the initial interviews and then you do the on-campus interviews and you get your offers. Legal writing jobs tended to be hired in the second semester. And so they were able to kind of see who was going to be, what positions were going to be open and if people are going to be leaving for some of these other positions because they went through the AALS process. So it became the second step that people were going through. Many of these jobs are advertised through the Legal Writing Institute, which is the main professional organization for legal writing folks. And so if you go to lwionline.org, you will see a listing of job positions all the time. And you can even put yourself on the listserv for the Legal Writing Institute. And they post those jobs all the time. What's really nice about the Legal Writing Institute online is that there's a required disclosure form that you have to fill out if you're going to post on that listserv that tells you everything you need to know about that job, because there's such a wide range of jobs out there for legal writing folks. It'll say if it's tenure track, or if it's just short-term contract, they'll tell you how much the pay is, the range of pay. They'll tell you how many students you have to teach. They'll tell you whether you have voting rights or not among the faculty and what those voting rights look like. So you get a good sense of how integrated that position is into the rest of the law school, because traditionally that's not been true. And I also want to just point out a little caveat. The ABA is now considering a change in their accreditation standards that is going to equalize full-time professors no matter what they teach. That there's got to be some type of job security that's similar to tenure no matter what you teach and where you teach. And so that's going to change it a little bit. And I think it's probably even going to move more of these positions towards the AALS market. We always called it the meat market, which is such a, but that was basically the word, because you're just going in there as cattle call almost, and you have these 25-minute interviews. But I got my job because of the fellowship program, and I can't overstate that enough, that was the most helpful thing, because it gave me a chance to do scholarship. The field to become a law professor is much more competitive now, and it's gotten more and more competitive over the years. The good news for all those people that are interested in teaching now, there's more openings now in the last 5 years than there's probably ever been in the last, I don't know, 50 or so years. Partially that's just because of a lot of professors are aging out, and law schools are starting to regain the number of students that they had way back before the crash. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunities out there, but those opportunities are still very competitive. And so I can't say enough, agree with Kyle enough about having scholarship. And so what legal writing people, if they're or any type of job, they're going to look to see what your scholarship potential is. They're not only going to want to know what scholarship you produce, but they want to know what is your your plan for doing scholarship going forward. So you're going to have those types of questions a lot. So yeah, you wrote on this. And what I always tell people to do, and I took this advice and did it, take something from practice that you did that was interesting to you and figure out if you can turn it into something that's scholarly. And I would work with a professor that's already written to kind of figure out how to do that and move that into. And then from there, take that and see what else you might be able to carry on from that particular article and going forward. So you can talk about that during your interview. Because the three questions that you're going to actually hear in that initial interview is, what's your scholarly plan? They're going to talk about that more probably in your interviews than your teaching, quite frankly, because that seems to be more interesting for other scholars. They want to know what you're doing. But one of the other changes I've seen happen at some of the schools I've been at, and most recently Mitchell Hamlin, there's also, in addition to the job talk, schools are requiring you to do some type of teaching demo. And it could be on any type of topic. And the professors are the students, and you're actually teaching. It's very awkward and weird. But what it does is it requires you to think differently and creatively. And it really, for schools that really emphasize teaching, that's become kind of another test for people to be able to do that. Now, if you're going to teach legal writing, the things that they're going to look for in legal writing is, do you have litigation or appellate background? And do you have something you're bringing to the table that's going to be experienced, that's going to be able to transition the type of doctrinal law that students are learning into some type of practice? They want to make sure you know how to practice law, because you're going to be teaching students how to do that. So that's really important. They're going to look for clerkship. Have you clerked for a state or federal judge? That's also seems to be very important to people, because it shows that you have some scholarly potential and ability to do that. And so I think those things, and I can't overstate the importance of just being a good person. I've seen a lot of people go through this process. On paper, they're dynamite. I mean, they've taught before, their scholarship is great. They're so connected everywhere that you can think of, but they come in and they're just a jerk, and they'll automatically lose because they're expecting you to be a good teacher, a good colleague, and somebody that they're going to want to work with. Because even though the 20% that we talked about is service, that service is working with your colleagues. And if you can't do that, they're not going to want to hire you. So be nice to every single person you meet. Be nice to the administrative staff. Be nice to the students. Be nice to the hotel staff, because that will get back to the school if you're mean to the hotel staff. I've seen that happen. And so be a good person. Scholarship's really important. Clerkships, doing well in law school, being able to talk about and fit your scholarship within some broader idea of what is happening in the law that you can fit your scholarship in, I think is important. But be humble, but confident. And I think that will take you a long way.
Great. All right. So Alex, yeah, you want to go ahead and chime in?
Just a couple of things that other folks' remarks made me think of. So one thing is, just if you are interested in clinical positions, an important resource to mention is the Clinical Legal Education Association, which is the sort of leading organization, for clinicians. So if you go to their website, they have like listings for job opportunities that are off cycle, but also they have some resources for like how to think about clinical education, like what is clinical education. And so there's some really great resources there. And then the other thing, two other things I wanted to mention. So I think one thing I was thinking about while people were talking is like, I think in terms of who's like the audience here, right? I think it's like, you could think of it as being a little bit different if you're already practicing versus if you're still a law student. So I think, one thing that's good to know, right, is like Kyle mentioned Professor Orlowski's blog. And if you go and look at it, she has these statistics for who gets hired into the entry-level doctrinal market. And you'll see that like, there's a very high percentage that have one of the three following, right? A fellowship, a clerkship, or like another type of advanced degree, like a PhD in a different discipline, and they do interdisciplinary scholarship. So it's kind of good to like take a look at the profile of most people and understand like what kinds of things there are. And she kind of tracks trends over time and like what the ratio is of people who have those different kinds of credentials. So it's kind of good to see what the different models are for, what professors tend to look like. And then for people who are practicing, I think one kind of big thing is, if you're practicing already, and this is a question I saw in the Q&A as well, like what how do you sort of like transition from being a practitioner into scholarship? especially if it can be difficult to find the time, right? So sometimes people do, just try to do that transition by doing something like a VAP or another kind of fellowship. But whether or not you can do that kind of really depends on your financial situation, right? For a lot of people who are practicing attorneys, that's a pretty big pay cut. You may be supporting a family, a partner, what have you. So, that can be challenging. And otherwise, you kind of just have to carve out the time, which can be really challenging if you're practicing, right? So it's just like, there are some ways to do it, but they all do come with some trade-offs. And then the other big thing, I think, that I've also had to kind of work through, even just being a clinician working on scholarship, is I think just the mentality you need to write scholarship can be really different from the mentality of practice, right? And so I think when you're in practice, you can kind of be really focused on like the nitty gritty, the day to day. And, one of the best pieces of advice I got was, that one of the big differences between scholarship and practice is like, it's like writing a law review article is not like writing a brief. And so like if you kind of go into it or you go into your job talk like you're arguing a brief, it's not going to go that well because it's less the idea that like, yes, you're supposed to have a thesis, right? You're supposed to have a hypothesis, but it's not necessarily that you're there to prove that it's absolutely correct, but that you're there to examine it and examine the issue like from all the different angles and sort of question yourself and whether you might be right and kind of look at things from 360 degrees. So I think one of the biggest things that's really hard to do is like be in the day-to-day of practice and like litigating these cases and then to lift yourself out and be like, I'm going to think about this in this fundamentally different way. There are some really great sort of like resources for people who are trying to get into this, right? Like, so for example, if you're on the clinical side, there's like a clinical law review workshop, which is a really supportive environment where you can submit a piece you're working on and get good advice from people and feedback about like what ways you're seeing that like are convincing the people, what things do people have questions about. So I think also like if you aren't like one of the benefits of being in something like a fellowship program is that you get that type of feedback from others, like who, you're going to be in these kind of workshops and symposiums. But if you can't manage to make yourself have that work for you of taking a few years out to do something like that, then there are other ways that you can try to get a similar type of feedback that are really valuable if you're trying to just transition your mindset into a scholarly mindset.
That's awesome. Thank you. All right, so we've got about 13 minutes left for questions. I've got a lot of questions in the Q&A and from when folks registered. So I'm just going to take a couple here. So I think, Nader, this one you might be able to help with. How can we get into teaching law or law-adjacent courses to undergrads? So I think you're currently teaching like an undergrad cohort. Do you have insight into how students might be able, or how folks might be able to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly think that if you raise that, so take a step back. First of all, I don't know that every law school offers that. So if there's some way for you to like try and figure that out, there's a whole undergraduate law degree program at USC that they're getting their BA from obviously USC, but then the law school then has courses for that. So I would look for schools that specifically offer that and then reach out to them. This one happened to just kind of fall in my lap. This is filed under like not very helpful advice, but just timing is really good sometimes and you just got to go with it. But obviously any law school that is, if you went to an undergrad to have a law school, ask them, check their website, do that, but definitely just do that. And then again, I think that it doesn't change the idea of still come with a course that you want to teach. USC obviously has like a big entertainment focus being in LA. So I think that makes sense. But if you're in a different industry in a different city, and you know that there's like an engineering school that's really big, for example, undergrad, maybe you want to teach them sort of like a patent or something else that might be complementary to that. Because a lot of my students, I would say probably 90% plan on going to law school, but there are 10% who just want to work in entertainment. And so this knowledge is just beneficial to them. So any industry specific knowledge, whether it's legal or not, that you can offer is a good thing.
Great. I see a couple of iterations on this question that I think I can answer briefly. It's the sort of question, do I need an advanced degree beyond a JD, like a PhD or an LLM? Or do I need a clerkship, or do I need a fellowship? And I think the answer to all of that is no, with the following caveat. So I think for adjuncting, the answer is absolutely no. You don't need any of that. What they prize is relevant practical experience and like Nader said, a desire to learn and a passion. For clinical and LRW jobs, it is a bit of a mixed bag. It depends on the school, and I think you need to follow up with the school and ask more information. If you want to teach as a full-time doctrinal professor on a tenured track, then I don't think it's necessary that you have any one of those three, but I think the more of those three you have, the more likely you are to get the job. Fellowships clerkships, and advanced degrees. And as we were talking about some of this data, the Venn diagram of who has those things overlaps substantially. The more you get, the more likely you are to land one of those full-time positions. How about this? If my identity interfaces with my scholarship or the subject that I teach, how do I navigate that? Should I prioritize or potentially steer away from subject areas that interface with my identity? I have a thought on this, and then I'd love to hear any other panelists. I'm an employment law and employment discrimination scholar, and early in my career, I steered into that, and I did focus on the intersection between employment discrimination and queer identities. And then I took a hiatus from that for about 5 to 8 years. When things were looking good in that space, and there wasn't as much, in my mind, as much need for scholarship urgently. And then things changed politically, and I moved to Texas, both of which changed my focus. And I'm now the only openly queer member of my faculty, and I'm frequently writing scholarship that appears in local and regional media to try to advance queer issues. So my view is that the ultimate goal of my scholarship is to try to make an impact and to try to change things for the better. So I would say if you feel that you're benefited from integrating your identity into your scholarship in service of whatever your goal is, I think it's worthwhile. The only caveat I would note is that law schools are still business. And if your primary teaching goal is sexual orientation or gender identity in the law or related topics, I think that for an adjunct position, that can be all you teach, and that's fine. But law schools are most likely going to want to hire you to teach more than just that if you're doing a full-time position. So I would say that you should also go on the market preparing to teach at least one or two of the big auditorium filling type courses. So I'm interested. Any other panelists have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was going to say I completely agree with that. Teaching law and sexual orientation or doing something along those lines is really, quite honestly, a secondary course type of thing. It wouldn't be something you would get hired to do. You're going to want to make yourself as marketable as possible by saying you can teach any of the required courses. So first-year courses of some sort, what you might specialize in. And there's some natural connections. So you might want to do constitutional law, and then your secondary thing is law and sexual orientation, or family law and sexual orientation. But I think one of those big courses, and the big courses are just what you would think, the required courses are things that are tested on the bar exam. That's what they need people to do mostly in those areas. And then you add on to that. I think there's been just in my career, over the course of my career, a huge shift in this area in both good and in strange ways. I think when I first came out, when I first became a law professor, I was out. That was never really a problem. I put it front and center. That's what I was comfortable with. And I think that's what you've got to kind of decide what you're comfortable with in terms of being able to, what you want your career to be developed around. I kind of just moved into teaching law and sexual orientation because there was nobody else doing it. I taught, one of my very first jobs was teaching at Arizona State, and nobody in Arizona has ever taught the course. And I taught it. And then as my career went on, that course became less interesting because the laws weren't that interesting to students anymore. So the very first time I taught it, my class was full of almost all straight folks. I mean, I didn't have hardly any self-identifying LGBTQ folks in my class because it was an interesting and developing area, and it was very interesting to them. I've taught the course probably 15 times over the course of my career. The last couple of times I taught, I haven't taught it probably in the last 7 or 8 years, where I think things have kind of reversed a little bit. But the topics became less interesting to students in the class. In my first couple of years, that's all they talked about all week was what we talked about in that class. They went back to their other law review offices or their groups, and they talked about it. Now it's just like, why is that a big deal? You know? But I think it's changed in the last few years because we've seen a lot of change, especially as it relates to the transgender community. So I think the point I wanted to make is focus on the big stuff. That's what will get you your job. Don't put down a bunch of specialty courses because you'll never get hired just for specialty courses unless you're going to be an adjunct.
All right, how about
I
this?
think
Oh,
I'll,
Alex, you want to
so
weigh
I,
in? Go ahead.
I wanted to add something here. So I think, yeah, it's quite, I think this is a really complicated question, right? And I think there's so many layers of nuance to like this question because it sort of speaks to this really fundamental question, which is really like, well, why do you want to do this and what is it about for you, right? Because I think if your goal is like, I just want to be a law professor, then there are many things that you can do that are purely strategic. But the question I think is that's more important is like, well, why do you want to do it and what's interesting to you? Because I think if your research interest, if you're genuinely just really passionate about a particular area, um, like I hesitate to tell people like don't do it at all, right? I think that when you're a junior, you kind of the strategic thing you have to think about is like, is there a way to like hook something onto it? So like for example, like if you practice in like contracts, and there's an aspect of that is gonna lean on your practice experience or your skill set, but also has a gender and sexuality component, it can be kind of smart to think about like, is there a way that like, if you're going to do a publication or have a job talk piece that touches on those issues, is there a way to also have it connect to like a 1L course that they're going to be looking to hire for so that there's kind of a strategic element. And I think a lot of people, if you're on the doctrinal side, think about like, after I get tenure, I can write whatever I want, but before then I want to be a little bit more strategic about what I publish about. I think the other thing to know, right, is that when you do write on things like gender and sexuality, a lot of the times, like the question is, how can you write about it in a way that makes people who are not queer think that it's relevant, so that you can get published in like more of a traditional law review rather than a law review, which like is not a bad thing necessarily, but depending on like what type of school you're trying to get hired by, like, and what ranking you're shooting for, sometimes like one challenge can be that the more your work seems like it's quote unquote niche, the harder it is to get the attention of like a mainstream kind of like publication. But again, I think that the tough thing about this is like, like it's also really important to like care about it because it's really hard to do scholarship and teaching if you don't care about it at all. Like everyone has to teach these one-on courses and some of them are a little bit boring, but like also like it's hard to spend your time, like 40% of your working days, like writing about topics that you're not passionate about. And I think if you can't make yourself interested in something, no one else is going to find it interesting either. And there's a lot of boring scholarship out there, frankly, but like it has to grab your interest enough that you want to write about it. And so, it's really important to think about that too, and to not be too strategic to the extent that you're losing your passion and your research interest, because I think that's like the soonest way to like not really have a lot of fun. And the nice thing about being a lawyer is there's a lot of ways to get paid that aren't going into academia, unlike if you were doing a PhD in like philosophy or something like that, right? So you have ample other opportunities to be employed. So why is it you want to do this? The other thing I'll just add, right, is like, it's still a thing, I think, especially for transgender candidates, right? So the reality is that the number of transgender or non-binary people who have tenure track positions or tenured positions in the law teaching market is still like, I can count them all on like the fingers of my hands. So I think, like I know, for example, the first person that, as far as we know, is an openly trans woman to go on the market as an out person and get an entry-level job. And her work is in anti-discrimination and equality, but she didn't do a job talk paper that was about trans rights. And I think for her, that was a strategic decision, right? Like she kind of just thought, it's going to be enough for me to be out there as like an openly trans woman on the market, and nobody else in that position had gotten a tenure track job before. And so, she was like, this is something I'm really interested in, but also like, this is going to be a way. It's like, it's not that they don't know that I'm trans, but I don't necessarily want everything to be about that, right? So I think that's kind of a reality that you have to kind of think a little bit about, but it's not the only way to do it. And some people do go on the market with things that are about gender and sexuality. It's just that if you want to do that, it is really important to know all of the ways in which that might impact how people are going to see you. And it maybe will be a little bit more of a thing you have to think about how you're going to handle a lot of different facets, more so than if you're like, this is just a paper about admiralty law and I happen to be insert category here. But I think at the end of the day, like, why are you a law teacher, as Ryan was going to? And so I think it's also, there's a lot of cost to like compromising too much about who you are, what you care about, who you want to be in the world. That's more than just a professional cost. I think there's also a personal cost there.
Great. Thank you, Alex. Well, we're just about at our time, so I think this is a good place to wrap. I can speak for myself, at least. If you do have follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to either take them or direct them to any of the panelists if they're specific to any of our panelists. Thank you to the National LGBTQ+ Bar, and thank you so much to all of our panelists. I really appreciate your time. Have a great evening, everyone. Thanks.